is the demonstration for the watercolor techniques. If you're at home and you don't have a roll of tape, what you can do is just take anything that is circular, or really you could trace anything, and you want to make sure that you have 10 spaces. So if I was going to do this, I would just take my pencil and circle or trace this bottle 10 times around the paper. It'll make it a little harder to paint because you're going to have to paint within the lines rather than relying on the tape to create those barricades for you. But if you have tape at home, you are welcome to use it. I would recommend some sort of masking tape. But what you're going to do with that tape is you're going to make sure that you have 10 spaces. So right now I've created 2 spaces. And if I put a piece of tape right about here, doesn't have to be really anything specific. I just wouldn't make any super tiny. Okay. So now I've got 3 spaces. I'm going to continue on until I have 10 spaces. Alright, so next what you're going to want to do is kind of smooth down all those pieces of tape, because if there's a big bubble or a wrinkle, what's going to happen is all that paint is going to go underneath it. So I would go ahead and smooth all of those pieces of tape down. Alright, and then you can see that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spaces. We're going to learn 12 different techniques, but 2 of those techniques are actually going to go on top of or work from what's already painted. So we're going to do 10 techniques and then 2 add-ons. The materials you're going to need are a paintbrush, paper towel, or several, your watercolor paints, a container for water, and then these are some additional materials that you'll need. If you're at home and you do not have access to any of these things, you are able to skip these, but if you are in class, I expect you to do all of these techniques. Now, one of them might sound weird, but is actually salt, isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol, usually used for minor wounds or cuts, but we're going to use it for some paint today, and a little piece of saran wrap or cling wrap, plastic wrap. Any of that will do. You just need a small piece, enough to cover one of your sections. And a crayon. So the first one that I'm going to show you is a flat wash. So a flat wash is really good for backgrounds where you just want one flat, smooth color. It's usually light. So I'm going to take some water. I'm going to drip it into the blue here. I'm going to let that sit for about just a minute or so. I recommend letting that water sit just so it actually soaks in and it's easier to mix if you let it sit. After you've let it sit, go ahead and swirl it around for a little while. You really want to take some time to actually swirl the water into the paint so it creates a thicker paint that actually has a lot of pigment in it or that color in it. I'm going to scoop that and move it over to my mixing spot over here. Just moving that paint over. I'm going to add more water, so just adding drops of water to here. I can swipe it off on that little edge, that ridge on the tray. So I just want a ton of this. I'm going to mix that in, so make sure my water is mixed in with my paint. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull that bead of water all the way across. I'm going to pull it over. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to lay it right next to my previous one. I want to try not to go over the same spot too many times, because with watercolor, the more you work an area or go back over an area, sometimes it'll give you those streaks, and sometimes you might want those streaks, but when you're doing a flat wash, you don't really want too many of those streaks. And if you have a bigger brush on hand than the one I am using, I would recommend doing that for a big area of flat wash. I'm just using a smaller brush in case this is the largest brush you have. I think I may have grabbed a brush that was too small. Also, make sure that you make enough paint for the spot you are going to paint. I am almost out. I think we'll make it. All right, and since I have these tape borders acting as little buffers, I don't have to worry too much. Now this is where it comes in handy to have that larger brush so you don't see as much of your brush strokes. I'm just gonna quickly and gently move all those big blobs of paint out of the way. Most of these should kind of settle and pool so it's nice and flat. So I have a really light hand when I'm trying to move that stuff around. So I'm trying not to overwork it too much so we don't see too many streaks, but that is just our flat wash. So I'm gonna prep my blue again. I'm gonna get some more. I'm gonna do a gradated wash, which is where you go from light to dark, kind of slowly blends, gradually blends, gradated. I'm not going to add too much water to this at first because I want it to be pretty strong. And just for kicks, I'm going to add a little bit of green to it just to make it a little more interesting. All right, I'm going to put lots of paint right up here at the top. So this is the gradated wash with one color, so I'm just going to make this same color lighter. All right, so what I'm going to do is I have lots of paint on my brush. I'm going to go ahead and paint this top section. I'm going to just gently dip it in water. I'm going to keep that big bead of water on my brush, and I'm going to kind of pull the rest of the paint further down. I'm going to dip it in water again. So I'm not really like shaking my brush in the water, I'm just quickly dipping it. So I still have a little bit of that blue-green paint on my brush. And then as I get to the end, I kind of run out and I've got almost clear water, not quite. Okay. And if you want to move that bold color a little bit lower, you can go back and kind of move from top to bottom. But at the top, you're starting with your strongest watercolor, and then as you get lower, you're just dipping it in water, so you're just adding more water as you go. Kind of overlap with the section you did before. So that's our gradated wash. We go dark to light. I'm going to rinse off my brush for the next one. We're going to do a gradated wash with two colors. So I'm going to go ahead and start with maybe a more green version of what I just did. Drop my brush so I don't put too much paint in my water. I'm going to clean off my brush. I'm going to pick my second color. I'm going to do yellow. And remember, it's better for your paint if you can let that water sit in that spot for a little bit and then swirl it around. Just take like a minute to let it soak in. And clearly my brush was a little bit dirty because my yellow was turning a little bit green. So I'm going to scoop all that out, try and get as much of that green out of there as I can. All right, and keep in mind, if you have a ton of water in your paint, I would be careful putting them in the same spot right here because they could bleed together. So I would maybe move it over into the spot next to it. Okay, I think I've got a decent amount of paint right here. I'm going to do a gradated wash with two colors now. So I'm transitioning from one color to the next. Move my water out of the way here. I'm going to go ahead and start with my yellow right here. So similar to a flat wash, I'm just going to start a section right here. I'm going to pick up my yellow. It's more of a yellow-green, isn't it? That's fine. And then once I get to a point where I want to start transitioning into the next color, I'm going to dip my brush without rinsing it into the next color. I'm going to overlap on my previous color. Dip it back in that next one again. Now if you notice that you transition too quickly, because I have all this space left, I'm going to dry off my brush, rinse it off, and I'm going to pick up more of that yellow. I'm just going to overlap on top of what I've already got. Kind of pull that mixture a little further down. And I'll go back over this lighter spot with that green again too. So right here I'm kind of overlapping those two, the yellow and the green, and then eventually as I move further and further away from my yellow section, I move my water, I'm going to start using more of just that green. So now I don't really have much overlap any of the yellow and green. I don't really have much yellow on my brush anymore, just transitioning into the green. So we've got gradated wash from one color to the next. That's our 2-color gradated wash. Make sure that you're rinsing your brush after every color change that you make. Next we're going to do wet in wet. So we're going to go ahead and kind of prime our surface with water. We're going to get it wet so that when we drop in the color, it's going to sort of do a blooming effect. So I'm going to drop some water on here. I'm going to try and get the whole surface wet with some water. You don't want it like swimming with water, but you do want the surface to be wet. And if any spots kind of look like they've dried up during that process, go ahead and add more water. And then pick a color that's already wet, and then I would add even more water to that. Pick that up and kind of just paint within this area. And you can see that it lets it spread a lot easier. It doesn't immediately soak into the paper. You can even add more water on top of that if you really want it to be soft and cloudy. I'm going to try and pick up a different color here, my green, and do the same thing. You can really see that it like sits on top of the water. It lets you manipulate it a little bit more. And again, you can always add a little more water as long as your surface is still wet. Kind of gives it a little bit of a tie-dye effect, huh? I'm going to go back in, keep adding some more colors until I've got this whole surface painted. So this technique is going to take the longest to dry because there is a lot of water in it. So I would be careful lifting your paper up while this one is still wet because it will drip down your page. So the next technique we're going to try is dry brush. I'm going to let that water kind of sit in my paint. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple drops of water to all my colors just so they can soak in while I wait. So I'm going to add that paint into my separated spot over here. Now what I'm going to do is, while I have lots of paint on my brush, I'm actually going to wipe it on the paper towel and then just carefully place it back in a little bit of paint, dry it off, and I'm going to kind of squish, maybe spread the brush bristles out just a little bit so they have a little air between them. Don't go crazy and like destroy the head of the brush, but you just want to spray them out, spread them out just a little bit. You want to make sure it's dry, but you can still have paint when you touch that paper towel. Then you're going to take this and you're just going to have a dry brush. So this is our dry brush technique. You're just going to add that kind of texture. Now if you run out of paint and it really just doesn't put much paint down, tap the paint again, tap your paper towel, you kind of fray it, make sure it's good to go, and keep adding more to it. This is good if you're just looking to add some texture, or if maybe you want to paint like something like grass. But it makes a really good, interesting texture. But so it goes paint, paper towel, and then you can go onto the paper. So that's your dry brush technique. This is also good if you want to get really specific with a line, but you don't want that water to really pool everywhere. All right, so that was our dry brush technique. Next, we're going to do the salt method. So with the salt method, you're going to start off with just a big area of wash. So you're just doing a flat wash, and before it dries, we're going to sprinkle some salt on it. So I'm just going to do a flat wash. All right, so with this flat wash, you kind of want to be a little bit quick because you want it all to be wet when you put the salt on. Otherwise, this will not work. Now, you won't be able to see the effects on mine, but when you sprinkle this salt on, you can be pretty generous with it, but what you want to see, or what you want to wait for, is till the next day when your paint is all completely dry. You can kind of see it start to work, especially where it's really nice and wet and there's lots of color, but you won't really get the full effect. Just put the rest of that salt on there. You won't get the full effect until the next day when all of your paint is dry. So I just wiped off all the extra salt just so it didn't get into my other areas that I don't want to use the salt method on. Next, we're going to do plastic wrap. And again, you can do a flat wash. You could do really any of these 4 techniques: the flat wash, the graded wash with 1 color, 2 color, or wet and wet. Really anything that's going to start you off with a wet base. That's what you're going to start off with for under the plastic wrap. All right, so you want your surface to be pretty wet when you start this off. I'm going to drop my brush right here, lay that down, and I'm going to grab my Saran wrap and try and place it right on top of my spot I just painted. And what I'm going to do is, to create even more interest, is kind of wrinkle the Saran wrap. So you'll be able to see the effect kind of start, but you won't really get the full effect until it totally dries. Similar to the salt one where you're going to have to wait a little bit, you're going to have to wait for this one to totally dry as well. I would wait until the next day to remove that Saran wrap. And then again, just wrinkle it up if you want even more of that crackly effect. Now, this next one, we're going to do Crayon Resist. So we're going to take our crayon, I'm going to draw some sort of design. I would recommend a light colored crayon, and I would press pretty hard because that crayon is what's going to prevent the watercolor from touching and soaking into the paper. I would choose a color that is different than the one that you made your lines with crayon, and you can draw whatever you want. You could write your name, you could do whatever you'd like. Go with orange. Maybe red orange. We'll do red orange. All right, and for this one, you don't want to go back over the crayon spot too much. If you go over it too much, it will start to soak into where the crayon is placed. You want to find a good balance of wet, but not like a huge puddle, because you can kind of see at the beginning there, I had too big of a puddle. So if I wipe that away, yeah, we can see our crayon underneath. So what you'll see is that that crayon is resisting the watercolor, so it actually prevents it from sticking onto the paper, and it pushes it off, so you can still see your design that you did underneath, which is pretty cool. All right, so next we're going to do the rubbing alcohol in this spot right here. Again, you're just going to need a wet painted base to start with. All right, so what I'm going to do while that is still wet, before it dries, I'm going to use the back handle end of my paintbrush, and I've poured a little bit of the rubbing alcohol into this cup. I'm going to dip just the back end of my paintbrush in, and I'm going to tap it on my paint. You can actually write with this or draw lines, or you could just tap it on your paper to make some dots. But yeah, it's pretty neat. It kind of pushes away all that pigment. There you go. And then the last one we're going to do to fill our space before we do our 2 extra ones at the end is lifting off with a paper towel. So this is a little bit like you're removing paint with a paper towel. So I'm gonna start off with a wet base of paint. I'm just gonna do a flat wash. And remember, I never wanna overwork it, because the more I go over that spot, it's gonna get more streaky. When it dries, it usually kind of smooths out a little bit. Now, before this paint dries, what I want to do is take a paper towel, and I can kind of crunch it up so just a little spot that I'm going to use. I'm going to press it down and do lifting off technique here. And what you kind of see is little brighter, lighter spots where you've kind of removed the paint a little bit. This is good if you did like a blue with the lifting off technique. You could create like little clouds if you wanted to. So it's a good way to kind of remove the paint with almost like a little bit of texture as well. Now onto the last 2 techniques that you actually are going to either add on or remove from the techniques you've already got. Now, if you are ever in need of erasing a certain area, you can actually erase with watercolors. Not a lot of paint allows you to do this, but watercolor will sometimes let you do this. So I'm going to go back to my flat wash area, and just because I know this one is dry, and I'm going to take a brush with just water. So I added water to my brush, and I'm going to kind of swirl this around in a spot. And you can see that by adding water back into it, I just dried off my brush so I can really wipe away all that extra water, because sometimes our brush will actually act as a sponge and it'll soak away water. So I'm drying off my brush after I've swirled it with water on here. I'm wiping away that excess water with my brush, and now I've kind of created an erased little spot. I'm going to try and make this a little more circular, almost as if maybe I could turn this into like a moon or a sun or something, really anything. So again, it's still wet, so I've dried off my brush. I'm going to use my brush to kind of soak up that excess water. And there we go. That is our erasing technique. I wouldn't have a giant drop of water hanging off your brush, otherwise it's really going to spread on that spot. But just make sure that the brush is wet when you do the erasing technique. Now the last one's really fun. We're going to do splatter. So make sure that you have some nice wet paint on your brush. So I'm going to try with this purple here. And you want it to be wet so it'll actually fling off of your brush. Now there are a couple different ways. You could just take your brush and splat, but that one, it usually ends up in a more larger splatter. What I like to do is use your finger, rest your hand on your table, and then use your finger as a stopper. And what it'll do, you're going to swing your brush until it hits your finger, and that rapid stopping motion is going to let all the rest of that paint spray out onto your paper. So try to keep this kind of localized so it doesn't affect the rest of your spots, but I totally get it if it gets on your other techniques. So that's it. So we've got all of our painting techniques, all 12 of them. And of course, there are probably more techniques out there, so if this really interests you, you can do more research on your own, but these are the 12 that I'm providing you. So this one, the first thing that we did on this spot was a flat wash. This was our gradated wash with one color, dark to light. This is our gradated wash with two colors, from one color to the next. And then we did our wet in wet, where we put down a base of water and added our color into it. It really helps it kind of bleed around and just spread out. We did dry brush, where we have a little bit of paint on our brush while it is dry. We did a salt technique. While it's wet, you sprinkle salt, wait for it to dry before brushing off that salt. So that's probably going to be from the next day. And then we did our plastic wrap. Make sure your surface is wet before you put the plastic wrap on. Wrinkle it for more texture. And we've got rubbing alcohol. Again, make sure your surface is wet with paint before dripping or drawing that rubbing alcohol on there. And then we've got our Crayon Resist, where you put down, press really hard with your crayon, and then put a nice one layer of paint over it. And then we've got lifting off with a paper towel, where you're putting a layer of wet paint and then immediately lifting off texture with paper towel. And then our two additive or subtractive methods is splattering, and then we also have erasing. Alright, so at this point all of my paint has dried. I've waited several hours, so I'm going to go ahead and peel off the plastic wrap or saran wrap. I'm going to rub off all of the salt, and I'm going to peel carefully all of this tape. Now, one tip with the tape, instead of pulling the tape straight up, I would recommend pulling it as flat down as you can and pull it at an angle. See, instead of pulling straight up like this, where you're going to probably tear some paper, I would pull it at an angle. Alright, so as you peel off the tape, you might see that sometimes the tape was really stuck to the paper and it might have peeled up some spots. So I would go back and carefully tear off any little flaps of paper that there are that are peeling up. But that is pretty much it. Just make sure that you peel off your saran wrap, all your tape as carefully as you can, and then rub off all of that salt. And then enjoy your hard work.